the Dead Sea Scrolls. And as some fragments in private hands are exposed as forgeries,
you have people that are straight and you have people that are crooked.
Scientists and scholars race to separate the real from the fake and make the invisible visible.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest surviving copies of biblical scripture ever found, preserved for over 2,000 years inside desert caves near the shores of the Dead Sea. Most people know they exist and think little more of it.
7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
But when scientists fed thousands of fragments of these ancient manuscripts into Grok AI, what it decoded along those blurred lines of Hebrew and Aramaic left researchers stunned. So what else did Grok find buried inside them? Join us as we explore what artificial intelligence uncovered when it read the Dead Sea Scrolls. The discovery that changed everything. One thing that is difficult to believe is that the oldest surviving copies of biblical scripture ever recovered were not found inside a museum vault, a university archive, or a carefully controlled excavation site managed by government archaeologists. They were found by a teenager who threw a rock into a hole in a cliff.
The Dead Sea is surrounded by caves, and as young teenage boys would do, they threw a rock into the cave, heard the sound of breaking pots, came back the next day, climbed into the cave, and what did they find? They found huge clay jars.
The year was 1947, and the location was a stretch of barren, heat-blasted wilderness above the northwestern shoreline of the Dead Sea in what is now the West Bank. The boy's name was Muhammad Ed-Dib, and the sound that came back out of that cliff opening after his stone went in was a sharp crack of breaking clay that turned out to be the most consequential noise made in the field of biblical history in the last 2 centuries. What came out of that cave, and the 10 others found nearby over the following 9 years, was almost impossible to process at first. But as the world would eventually discover, Grok AI walked into that centuries-old puzzle and began doing in months what traditional scholarship could not finish in decades. So stay with us, because what it found is not something you want to miss. Nearly 900 ancient manuscripts had been sitting in the Dead Sea caves, some sealed inside clay storage jars, others broken apart into thousands of tiny, brittle pieces across the cave floors. Some fragments were no bigger than a coin. Researchers dated the documents to somewhere between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. That placed them well over 2,000 years old, which made them the oldest known surviving copies of biblical literature on Earth. The region surrounding the Dead Sea is one of the driest places on the planet. There is almost no rainfall there, no stable underground temperatures all year round. Those conditions, combined with the airtight seal of clay jars, had kept parchment and papyrus alive through 2 full millennia without rotting. Nothing else like it has ever been found anywhere. The scope of what those caves contained stunned researchers immediately. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, every single book of the Hebrew Bible was represented among the recovered texts, with one exception, the Book of Esther. Beyond the biblical material, there were hymns, community rule books, apocalyptic writings, and detailed prayers that collectively revealed the inner life of a Jewish sect that had walked away from mainstream society entirely. Most scholars identify this group as the Essenes, a disciplined and deeply serious Jewish movement that had concluded the religious leadership in Jerusalem was beyond saving. They were not hiding, instead, they were preparing. The scrolls they produced and preserved in those caves were the written record of a community that believed the end of the age was close, and that their specific beliefs and practices were the only appropriate response to what was coming. Everything they wrote, copied, and sealed away in those clay jars pointed toward that single consuming conviction. And that's not all. The controversy surrounding these documents did not end with their discovery. For decades after the Dead Sea Scrolls were first found, a tightly controlled circle of scholars held exclusive access to hundreds of unpublished fragments, keeping the broader academic world completely locked out for years. Debates grew heated. Even accusations went everywhere. Some researchers spent entire careers waiting for access to materials they were never permitted to study. When that grip finally loosened in the early 1990s and wider access became possible, researchers encountered a problem that would define the field for another generation: thousands of disconnected pieces. Ancient scripts demand years of specialist training just to begin reading. Surfaces darkened and damaged beyond easy interpretation. Entire passages where the text had simply ceased to exist, worn away by time into blank, unreadable parchment. Working through that volume of material using traditional methods, magnifying glasses, careful hand photography, painstaking human analysis line by line, meant progress moved at the pace of individual careers rather than years. Scholars devoted entire working lives to small sections of the Dead Sea Scrolls and still left questions behind them unanswered when they retired. The physical challenge alone was extraordinary. Many of the fragments had fused together over centuries of compression inside their storage jars. Others had warped, cracked, or partially dissolved where moisture had occasionally penetrated their containers. Infrared photography helped reveal text on surfaces too darkened to read with the naked eye, but even that technology had limits. Connecting thousands of loose fragments into coherent documents required matching not just content, but physical edges, fiber patterns, and ink composition across pieces that had been separated for 2,000 years. It was the equivalent of reassembling 1,000 different jigsaw puzzles that had all been mixed together in the same box, with half the pieces missing from every single one of them. 70 years passed that way. Generation after generation of dedicated scholars chipping away at a problem that kept proving larger and more complicated than the last generation had left it. Important discoveries were made, and it did not stop at that because meaningful translations were completed. But the full picture remained stubbornly out of reach, buried inside a volume of fragmented, damaged, ancient material that human effort alone could not get through fast enough. Then artificial intelligence entered the picture, and what came after that was indeed shocking. Keep watching until the end to really understand this mystery. What artificial intelligence found before Grok arrived. Before Grok ever touched the Dead Sea Scrolls, other artificial intelligence systems had already been quietly working on the problem of ancient manuscripts for years. The results were impressive enough to turn heads in academic circles, but not quite enough to crack the deepest questions the scrolls were still holding back. Understanding what Grok brought to this investigation requires understanding what came before it, because the gap between those earlier tools and what Grok is capable of is not a small one. In 2019, DeepMind, the artificial intelligence research laboratory owned by Google, developed a system called Pythia. It was built specifically to help recover missing letters and words from damaged ancient inscriptions. Pythia was a genuine step forward, but it operated within tight boundaries. It could suggest what a missing word might be based on surrounding text, but it could not place that word in broader historical context, could not date the document it was reading, and could not tell researchers anything about where the text had originally come from. It was a sophisticated gap filler, nothing more. 3 years later, DeepMind went further with a more advanced system called Ithaca, named after the Greek island in Homer's Odyssey. Ithaca was trained on tens of thousands of ancient Greek inscriptions and could do something Pythia never could. It restored damaged text, estimated when a document was written, and suggested where it had geographically originated, all at the same time. When historians used Ithaca alongside their own expertise, their accuracy in restoring damaged ancient texts jumped from 25% to 72%. That number is extraordinary, but Ithaca had a significant limitation. It was built for ancient Greek inscriptions carved into stone and metal surfaces, not for the fragile parchment and papyrus of Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts. its training data simply did not extend to the world of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But what scientists needed was something that could reach far beyond stone carvings and Greek inscriptions, something built for the fragile ancient world of Hebrew and Aramaic parchment. That search brought them to 2021, when a team of researchers at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands developed an AI tool specifically designed to analyze the handwriting patterns inside the scrolls themselves. Using this system, they examined the Great Isaiah Scroll, one of the most complete and significant manuscripts in the entire Dead Sea collection, and discovered that what scholars had long assumed was the work of a single scribe was actually the product of two different hands. Two scribes, working in a shared formal style so consistent that human eyes had missed the distinction entirely for decades. That was a meaningful discovery. But the Groningen tool was narrow in its focus. It could compare handwriting. It was not built to read, interpret, connect, or analyze content at scale across hundreds of documents simultaneously. By June of 2025, the same Groningen team released a new system they called Enoch, trained to combine radiocarbon dating data with AI-based handwriting analysis to estimate when individual scroll fragments were written. Enoch tested 135 undated manuscripts and consistently produced older date estimates than human paleographers had assigned. Some fragments came back as potentially 50 to 150 years older than previously believed. The lead researcher noted that some of those findings raised eyebrows even among specialists who spent careers studying the same documents. Enoch was pushing the timeline of early Judaism further back than anyone had expected. But Enoch was still a dating tool. It was not reading the scrolls for meaning. It was not connecting content across documents. And it failed to even build a picture of the community, their beliefs, their disputes, or the full architecture of what they left behind. That is the gap Grok walked into. Developed by XAI, Grok operates at a scale and depth that none of these earlier systems were designed to reach. Where Ithaca worked on stone inscriptions and Enoch focused on dating parchment fragments, Grok processes meaning across entire bodies of ancient literature simultaneously. It holds the full linguistic context of ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek in active consideration at once, cross-referencing content patterns, theological themes, scribal habits, and textual variations across hundreds of documents in the time it takes a human scholar to work through a single page. It does not get tired. It does not even carry decades of academic assumptions into a text. And crucially, it is not limited to one narrow question. It reads everything, and it looks for everything. When researchers began feeding the Dead Sea Scrolls into Grok, they were not expecting a revolution. They were hoping for faster translations and better fragment matching. What they got was something else entirely. So stay with us as we delve into the findings of Grok AI. Grok AI's discovery. One of the first things Grok did when researchers fed it the full scope of Dead Sea Scrolls data was something no human scholar had ever been positioned to do. It held every document in active consideration at the same time. And what it found, sitting inside that mass of ancient material, hiding in plain sight across 70 years of human study, was a web of deliberate connections that nobody had fully mapped. Scholars had long known the scrolls covered a wide range of material: biblical texts, community regulations, hymns, prophecy, legal debates, apocalyptic visions. What they had generally treated these as was a collection, a library in the loosest sense, documents gathered and preserved by a community over time. What Grok identified was something structurally different. The scrolls were not simply accumulated over generations the way a household collects books. The linguistic patterns, the recurring theological phrases, the specific vocabulary choices, and even the physical characteristics of the parchment across different documents pointed toward a coordinated body of work, texts that were deliberately designed to speak to each other. The Community Rules Scroll, one of the most studied documents in the entire collection, had always been understood as a straightforward regulatory text. It outlined membership requirements, described punishments for violations, and established the hierarchy and daily rhythms of life at Qumran. Scholars read it largely as a practical document. What Grok found threaded through that same text were linguistic signatures and thematic markers that connected directly to the war scroll on one side and to several prophetic commentaries called Pesharim on the other. The community was not simply following rules to stay organized. Their daily conduct, their admission procedures, their ritual baths, their communal meals, all of it was architecturally tied to an apocalyptic framework they believed was unfolding around them in real time. The War Scroll makes this framework explicit in ways that are difficult to overstate. It describes in precise military detail a coming 40-year conflict between two cosmic forces, the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. The Sons of Darkness are identified through coded language as Rome, referred to as the Kittim, alongside other Jewish groups the Qumran community considered corrupt. The Sons of Light are themselves. This was not abstract theology. It was a battle plan built around a conviction that they were the chosen remnant standing at the hinge point of history, and that the regulations in the community rule were the spiritual preparation required before that final confrontation could begin. Grok's ability to trace these thematic threads across multiple documents simultaneously gave researchers a much clearer picture of how tightly integrated this ideological system actually was. These people were not collecting scrolls. They were building a theology from the ground up, document by document, each one reinforcing the others. What also emerged from Grok's analysis was evidence of active engagement with these texts over long periods of time. Annotations, marginal marks, and correction layers across different documents suggested generations of community members reading, debating, and cross-referencing material the way modern scholars use footnotes and citations. The scrolls were living documents inside a living intellectual community, not static relics waiting to be discovered. The level of structured literary activity this implies is significantly more sophisticated than earlier scholarship had generally credited to this desert group. These were not isolated mystics copying scripture mechanically in the wilderness. They were engaged in a serious, sustained, multi-generational theological project with a very specific goal in mind. And this is the very part you don't want to miss out on. If the hidden library system revealed how the Qumran community organized their beliefs, the calendar question reveals why they believed their break from the rest of the Jewish world was not negotiable. And this particular discovery carries implications that stretch far beyond the desert community itself, all the way into questions about the timing of events at the very center of Christian history. The calendar dispute sitting inside the Dead Sea Scrolls is not a minor administrative disagreement. It was a theological fracture that struck at the heart of what the Qumran community considered legitimate worship. The mainstream Jewish calendar of the Second Temple period was lunisolar, built around the cycles of the moon, with periodic adjustments to keep the festivals aligned with the agricultural seasons. The temple establishment in Jerusalem operated on this calendar. The rest of the Jewish world largely followed it, but the scrolls preserve a completely different system, a 364-day solar calendar that the Qumran community considered the only authentic way to mark sacred time. Researchers at the University of Haifa spent an entire year assembling over 60 tiny fragments written in a coded script before successfully reconstructing one of the last undeciphered scrolls in 2018, and what it revealed was a detailed accounting of this solar calendar in operation. The 364-day system divided the year into 4 perfectly equal seasons of exactly 91 days each. Every season contained 13 weeks without exception. Because 364 divides cleanly and completely by 7, every single festival and holy day falls on the same day of the week every year without variation. No festival ever landed on the Sabbath. No scheduling conflict between sacred observances was possible. The community considered this mathematical perfection to be a direct reflection of divine order, and they considered the lunar calendar's messiness, with its leap months, shifting dates, and occasional collisions between the Sabbath and major festivals, to be evidence of corruption and human interference with God's appointed times. The real-world consequences of this divide is shocking. The Qumran community celebrated Passover on a completely different date than the priests in Jerusalem. Their Yom Kippur fell on a different day. Their wheat harvest festival, their wine harvest, and their oil harvest festivals, celebrations found in the temple scroll but absent from the Torah itself, existed on a calendar the rest of Judaism did not recognize at all. There is a remarkable passage in the Pesher Habakkuk, one of the prophetic commentaries from the scrolls, that describes the wicked priest, widely understood to be the high priest in Jerusalem, traveling to the teacher of righteousness at Qumran on what the scroll identifies as Yom Kippur. For observant Jews, travel on Yom Kippur is completely forbidden. The only way this account makes sense historically is if both men were operating on different calendars and the day that was Yom Kippur for the Qumran community was simply an ordinary working day for the high priest. That single passage, correctly understood, reveals the depth of the rupture between these two worlds. Grok's contribution here was to map the full extent of these calendar references across the scrolls as an integrated system rather than isolated passages. Astronomical calculations, festival rotation tables, seasonal markers, and Sabbath cycle records scattered across multiple documents were identified and connected in ways that showed the community was tracking celestial movements with serious precision. This was not folk religion. It was an organized astronomical and theological program built on the conviction that the correct calendar was a matter of eternal consequence. The implications for early Christianity sit just beneath the surface of this discovery, and scholars have been circling them carefully for decades. The Gospel accounts of the Last Supper and the crucifixion contain timeline details that have never reconciled cleanly with each other. The Synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, describe the Last Supper as a Passover meal. The Gospel of John places the crucifixion on the day of Passover preparation, which would make the Last Supper the night before Passover, rather than the Passover meal itself. These accounts appear to contradict each other on a point of basic chronology. Some scholars have long suspected that the answer to this apparent contradiction may lie not in scribal error, but in competing calendar systems operating simultaneously in first-century Judea, exactly the kind of division the Dead Sea Scrolls document in detail. Grok's systematic mapping of these calendar texts is giving researchers new tools to pursue that question with a precision that was simply not available before. But this story is far from over, because as we are about to find out, what Grok found next about the coming Messiah is something scholars have circled for decades but never fully cracked. So stay tuned, because this would change how you understand salvation entirely. Grok's revelation on the Messiah. Buried across multiple documents in the scroll collection was a messianic framework so different from what most traditions teach that it forces a fundamental rethinking of what Jewish expectation actually looked like in the centuries surrounding the birth of Christianity. The assumption most people carry is simple, that there is one Messiah, one arrival, one moment that changes everything. The Qumran community was working from something far more architecturally complex than that. Across at least 13 texts in the collection containing messianic content, the picture that emerges is not a single figure, but a structured arrangement of at least 2 and possibly 3 distinct roles that the community expected to see filled at the end of the age. The community rule states it plainly. The community was to govern itself according to its founding principles until the coming of a prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. That word, messiahs, plural, is not a copyist error or a translation quirk. It is confirmed in the Damascus document and in several other sectarian texts across the collection. The Messiah of Aaron was a priestly figure, a descendant of Moses' brother whose authority over spiritual matters would exceed that of the kingly Messiah. He would oversee atonement, temple worship, and the correct interpretation of sacred law. The Messiah of Israel was the warrior king from David's bloodline who would lead the military campaign against the enemies of God's people and establish the kingdom by force. These two figures were not rivals. They were a team, each assigned a specific domain, arriving together at the moment the community had spent generations preparing for. Then there is a third figure which changes everything. Multiple texts point toward a prophetic forerunner whose assignment was to arrive before the other two and make the ground ready, exposing false teaching, interpreting the law accurately, and gathering the faithful into proper readiness. Some researchers have noted careful parallels between this figure and how the New Testament later describes John the Baptist. Others have pointed to a fragment known as 4Q521, the Messianic Apocalypse, which describes a coming Messiah who heals the sick, restores sight to those who cannot see, raises the dead, and announces good news to the poor. Scholars writing in peer-reviewed journals have noted that this exact sequence of miraculous signs appears in Luke chapter 7, written roughly 150 years after 4Q521, where Jesus uses the same list to answer John the Baptist's question about whether he is the expected one. Whether the Gospel writers knew this scroll directly or drew from a shared well of messianic expectation that both communities inherited, the overlap is too precise to dismiss. Grok's ability to map these connections across the full body of scroll literature gave researchers a clearer view of just how saturated this world was with messianic anticipation, and how complicated, how layered, and how theologically serious that anticipation actually was. What Grok surfaced next was not a theological argument or a calendar dispute. It was something more personal than either of those things. It was the sound of people praying. Among the first 7 scrolls recovered from Cave 1 in 1947 was a document scholars call the Hodayot, a Hebrew word meaning thanksgiving. The scroll runs nearly 30 reconstructed columns of text, and fragments of at least 7 separate copies have been found scattered across different caves, making it one of the most widely distributed documents in the entire collection. The community was clearly not storing this away for safekeeping. They were using it constantly. What it contains is a body of sacred poetry, hymns, prayers, and songs that belong to no tradition the outside world had ever seen. These compositions are not casual devotional verses. They open with a phrase that repeats throughout like a pulse, "I give thanks to you, O Lord," and then move into territory that is dense, personal, and theologically raw. Scholars studying the Hodayot have described its style as a mosaic built from the language and imagery of the Hebrew Bible, but reshaped entirely around the specific experience of the Qumran community. The writers describe themselves as people who have been granted access to hidden knowledge that the rest of the world cannot perceive. One hymn speaks of a writer whose spiritual hearing had been shut until something broke through and reached him in a place he describes as a hardened heart. Another composition, known as the Self-Glorification Hymn, goes further still. The author articulates a sense of union with the angelic realm so complete, so sustained by divine acceptance, that it sits unlike anything else in ancient Jewish religious literature. What Grok contributed to the understanding of these psalms was context at scale. By processing the Hodayot alongside the War Scroll, the Community Rule, the calendar texts, and the Messianic documents simultaneously, the AI mapped the emotional interior of the same people whose beliefs had been reconstructed through their regulations and their apocalyptic frameworks. The writers of these hymns were the same people preparing for a 40-year cosmic war, the same people running a coordinated library system, the same people who had walked away from Jerusalem convinced that the entire religious establishment had gone wrong. These songs show what all of that cost them internally, the suffering it required, the extraordinary certainty it produced, and the quality of devotion it generated in people who had surrendered ordinary life entirely to wait for something they believed was coming. And then Grok turned its attention to something that had been sitting in plain sight since 1947. What exactly was that? Curious to find out? Keep watching. The Great Isaiah Scroll is the only completely intact manuscript in the entire Dead Sea Scrolls collection. 7.34 meters of parchment, virtually the full text of Isaiah, dated somewhere between the 3rd and 1st century BCE. For nearly 70 years, the accepted scholarly position was straightforward. One scribe had copied this scroll from beginning to end. The handwriting looked consistent. There was no obvious seam, no reason to look harder. When researchers at the University of Groningen fed the scroll's high-resolution imaging data into a neural network trained on handwriting pattern recognition, the machine found what human eyes had missed for 7 decades. Sitting at columns 27 through 29, roughly the midpoint of the document, was a transition. On one side of that point, the letter formations carried one set of measurable micro-level characteristics. On the other side, a different set. The way certain letters curved differed in ways too small and too consistent to be accidental variation within a single hand. Word spacing shifted by margins invisible to the naked eye, but statistically significant when measured at scale across the entire scroll. The variance in stroke patterns was measurably higher in the second half. 2 scribes had produced this document, not one, and they had been carefully mirroring each other's styles so precisely that the boundary between them had gone undetected through generations of expert analysis. That finding alone was remarkable. What made it consequential was what it implied about the community. 2 people mirroring each other's handwriting on a single manuscript is not casual behavior. It is the product of shared training, common standards, and organized oversight. The Qumran community was not a loose gathering of devoted individuals, each preserving texts on their own initiative. Behind the scrolls was a structured scribal program, a system through which methods and standards were passed from one generation to the next, with enough consistency to produce near-identical writing styles across entirely different hands. Grok's analysis of the micro-level patterns across the full scroll gave researchers their first hard forensic evidence of exactly how coordinated and how disciplined that culture actually was. The scrolls did not preserve themselves. They were the product of an institution. Which of these discoveries shocked you the most? And what other secrets do you think Grok will pull out of these ancient scrolls next? Like, share, and subscribe. And click the next video on your screen. You will not regret it.